Prologue. Lab Tech Second Class Hallman leaned over his workbench and returned his mortar and pestle to its place. The newest sample of bone had arrived this morning from Adept Cleve, and the preliminary auto-analyzer was humming away. He hadn't ground a sample down himself in years, and now he remembered why. He brushed his hands and some of the remnant bone residue puffed into the air. Definitely checking on Flip when this is done, he thought, suddenly not taking his assigned servitor for granted. Jalen better have him repaired. As the analyzer whirred through its pre-programmed routines, Hallman took a swig of the last of his recycled water. It was more from a physical need than a desire. Despite the filters and assurances from Mackie that the water was safe to drink, he still tasted the metallic tang of a mysterious early death in each cup. Not as early as not drinking it, he chuckled to himself. He counted himself lucky here on Tumladen Station. As a small facility orbiting a dead world and away from any major or even minor trade routes, they managed to live well. For one, the work was interesting. He also had his own lab space. This was something a relatively minor mechanicus technician such as he could only dream of on a forge world like where he had attended Collegia. The food was bad, but that was nothing new. He did feel uncomfortable being out this far with no protection, other than a few autoguns and void shields only good for stopping microscopic space debris. But that was the lot of many researchers, out on the fringes and always short of funds. He sat down on his chair as the device worked, beeping now instead of humming, and immediately shot back up as if he'd sat on a tack. He frowned at his lack of inspiration and coughed as some of the dust jumped off his lab coat. The jolting change from sitting to standing was a habit he'd gotten into at the Collegia, because once it had been his catalyst for discovering the solution to a novel engineering problem. The fact that the adept teaching them took the idea as his own and was promptly promoted away from the boring duty of instructing initiates was beside the point. The method had worked. The proof that it was not a one-off was about to be on display as the auto-analyzer let out a ding, signaling its task was complete. Hallman finessed the sample out of the intake port and into pre-made molds of his own devising. The molds were fashioned with special ceramics that affected the color and shape of the bone based on the properties he was testing. All the ceramics were sanctioned by the mechanicus and well known. It was the last ingredient that he kept hidden. Bending down under the workbench, he pushed aside strategically placed junk bins to reveal a small lockbox. Out of habit, he checked the room behind him, paranoia not allowing him to open the box without doing so, even in private. He keyed in the code and popped open the lid, exposing several full droppers within. The idea for the liquid innovation came months before when he first began receiving the bone samples. He was sitting on his chair, wondering what to do with this odd material and with precious little guidance from Adept Cleve on what to look for, when Flip had his first malfunction. The servitor mistook the fuel can for the water container and poured it into the coolant unit for the small generator powering the lab's machinery. The resulting explosion burned the servitor and scared Hallman half to death, launching him out of his chair and into the realm of genius. Flip was consigned to be scrapped after the mishap, but Hallman fought hard to save him. He was a good luck charm now. He of course did not share the recipe for this valuable chemical or his eccentric method of finding it with his colleagues or leadership. With as much speed as was advisable, he put 2 drops into each mold and packed the droppers in safe back behind its veil of debris. The process required some time to cure, so Hallman picked up his empty 5-gallon hydration container and started the 200-meter pilgrimage to Mackie's domain. The corridors of the station were tight, with room for 2 to pass each other with a little room to spare. The metal walls were old but well maintained. There was no evidence of rust or warping, just the aged dullness of a bored life watching precious little happen. He encountered no one in the passageways, which was not uncommon. There were 25 of them aboard. Well, 26 now with the newcomer, he thought. The station was designed for 100, plus all the lab areas. Plenty of space if one wanted it. After a few turns, he came to a round metal door with a wheel attached in its center. He didn't know how or where Mackie got this setup, but the adept never said anything to her about unsanctioned methods, and it had a quaint feel to it that he liked. Hallman knocked. A thin metal plate slid aside at chin level, and 2 beady eyes peered out at him for a moment. The grill slid shut, and the wheel began to spin. Several attached metal struts, each screaming for lubricant and equipped with a little child's bell, pumped back and forth into the door, somehow opening it amidst the tumult of sound. Hallman had no idea how it functioned, but always enjoyed watching. The Mechanicus was staid and conventional to the point of fanaticism. This was something made by a real person. Mackie stood there in the doorway holding a wrench and sporting her normal grin, the one that always looked like she was trying not to laugh in your face. Her coveralls were encrusted with grime and her hair needed combing, but she was easy enough on the eyes at this time in the morning. She looked at him and then at his hydration container. "They always come crawling back," she said, pushing the door open the rest of the way and spitting on the ground. She started walking over to the cleanest looking of the refill spigots. Faced with such grace and delicacy, who could resist? She snorted over her shoulder at that and said, "And nothing screams romance like bone dust." On cue, he sucked in a hard breath from his nose and hoovered up the powder he'd forgotten to wipe off his mustache, causing him to sneeze and hack. This violent action released all the residue clinging to his lab coat, and before he knew it, there was a cloud of superfine bone dust fragments orbiting him like tiny asteroids, stinging his eyes and hampering his breathing. Mackie flipped her bandana up over her nose and laughed, making no effort to help him as he gagged. Cursing Flip for being broken, he tried to blow the dust away while stumbling into an open corner. This only swirled the particles and worsened his predicament as this new ill-fated constellation moved with him. He heard a spigot turn on and looked up through his bleary, tear-filled vision just in time to see a bucket discharge a couple gallons of icy water towards him. The liquid hit him squarely in the face, shocking his body with its coldness. The bone dust instantly formed a sticky, dough-like substance on his face and clothes. He could breathe again, but his eyes were still irritated and gummed up. "I need another," he heard himself saying, and Mackie obliged. Hallman lugged his full hydration container back through the passageways, listening to the swish of the water against the plastic form a duet with the squishing from his soaked boots. Every 10 meters, the breeze of recycled air from the vents on his bare, wet skin reinforced his desire to retrieve the servitor. "I will never take you for granted again, my wonderful, mindless friend," he thought. Nearing the intersection of the passageways leading to his lab space, Hallman suddenly came up short. He sniffed the air, smelling the caustic, acrid scent of burning organic material. Fear gripped his insides, and he hefted the water jug. Instead of turning left to his own spaces, he turned right towards the main labs, including Adept Cleave's personal workshop, and began to run, his boots leaving a trail of wet footprints behind him. Any fire on an isolated station like this was indeed an emergency. Following his nose for about 100 meters, Hallman passed a few empty workrooms and storage lockers, searching for the source of the smell. The passageways were still empty, which was odd in this area. The Adept usually had at least a couple servitors running some kind of errand. Panting now, he switched the jug's handle to his other hand, not wanting to risk dropping it, and skidded to a halt. Hallman had no olfactory enhancements, but this was definitely the source. In front of him was the large steel-plated double door leading into Adept Cleave's workshop. He raised a finger, trembling from his effort, to the Vox speaker, intending to ensure via the least intrusive means possible that all was well. He needn't have bothered. The door's two halves slid into the bulkhead to reveal a large, muscle-bound servitor. Its vocalizer emitted scratchy, low-Gothic requests to be let through, citing its owner's authorities and titles in a way that sounded like an obituary written by someone who didn't know the deceased but wanted to get the facts right. The lab tech moved and let it pass, almost choking on the smell emanating from the workshop. Not reassured as to the lack of emergency, servitors would continue with pre-programmed tasks almost regardless of the situation. It was their main strength and weakness. Hallman peered into the room. He instantly regretted the decision. Adept Cleave, his back to Hallman, was the source of the stench. Or, more precisely, his task was the source. A mechadendrite with a plasma cutter end was stripping away ceramide armor from a huge human body, much larger even than the servitor he encountered. The specimen was tied down on a massive slab, angled so the adept could work while standing upright. Masses of cables and tubing were connected to every conceivable point on the transhuman body. As he watched, the adept finished his cut and a large black shoulder plate crashed to the floor, the white serpentine decal dancing in the sparks from the cutter as it bounced and settled to the floor. Its edges were covered in bone, very much like the weekly samples Hallman received. And then the massive, still-living patient shifted in its restraints, revealing a misshapen head sporting a mutated bone spike. Hallman's shaking hands and clammy skin now had nothing to do with the cold water bath at Mackey's or his exertion to arrive here. This was an Astartes, and no mistake. Backing away and allowing the automated motion sensor to close the door, Hallman tried to calm his breathing as he made his way back to his lab. His thoughts raced around in his head. What was that? Is this sanctioned? He had been given no warning and no intimation that there was anything that sensitive here. And the mutations. Was this not one of the Emperor's chosen? He came around the last corner to his lab and paused in surprise. The door was ajar. He was sure he had closed and locked it, standard procedure and all. His distress somehow mounting further, he decided to go in and confront whoever was intruding into his space. There was little other choice on a station this small. He shuffled in, nearly dropping the hydration container when he saw who was there. The newcomer, Chirac, no one had thought to give Hallman another name, title, or position, stood with his back to him in a pristine white lab coat examining the specimens the tech had placed in the molds. He was about 2 meters tall and thin to the point of emaciation. His black hair was combed back in perfect order. Hallman would have noticed all these things, but it was the device that stole all of his attention. On the back of Chirac's neck was a piece of metal. As Hallman looked, he realized it wasn't on his neck as much as it was a part of his neck, embedded into the flesh. The device seemed to draw Hallman's attention, but then he felt his vision slide off and around it, making it difficult to focus on. It was a dull gray like the passageways, but shiny black and silver lines ran along it in tiny channels, perhaps delicate wiring. Above Chirac's head, there were a dozen of Hallman's reference books from his collegiate training. He doubted any of them could show a pattern of circuitry matching that of the lines. Without taking his eyes off the specimen, Chirac spoke.
Please come in. Hallman, is it?
His voice was deep and resonant, seeming to be at odds with his frame and appearance.
Indeed, sir,
Hallman managed, his cracking voice matching exactly how he felt. As far as he knew, this man only spoke to Adept Cleve. After what Hallman had just witnessed in the Adept's chambers, he doubted Chirac's presence here was a social call. He set the hydration container down with difficulty, dropping it halfway to the ground and not noticing as it toppled over. The old lid failed in its duty as the suspect water leaked out onto the floor towards the drain in the center of the room. What was this man doing here? He tottered forward and felt his discomfort grow. As he neared the taller man, he noted something else strange about the device. He was familiar with many forms of augmentation from his years of training on the Forge World, everything from basic scanners that could be conveniently removed to permanent full-body replacements available only to the elite. This piece of tech was different, and now he knew why. Its properties were strange enough by themselves, the aura of otherness, the alien pattern of wiring, and the way it drew and repelled the eyes. But those weren't the true characteristics that caused his unease. All of that could be explained away. Hallman realized that this wasn't a graft or even an implant. It seemed to be part of Chirac. It seemed to have come out from inside him. As he neared, Chirac turned, holding a now fully cured mold in one hand. The entire pile had turned a dark purple and congealed together. Hallman swallowed with difficulty. The result proved the bone was still alive and regenerating. The recognition must have been written on his face because Chirac's own lit up. His smile was too wide, bypassing his hollow cheeks and rising almost to his bright, clear eyes. His 2 neat rows of teeth were the same color as his coat.
You have done well, Hallman. This is a truly magnificent process you have discovered here,
said the whip-thin stranger, revealing one of Hallman's droppers in his other hand. Hallman's jaw dropped open, disbelief outrunning his terror. He never got a chance to feel the second emotion, as Chirac rammed the reinforced glass through Hallman's eye and straight into his brain, stopping only when it shattered against the back of his skull. Chapter 1. The glow from Lieutenant Ajantis' lumen played over the cream-colored, uneven organic blobs, causing odd shadows to dance along the violated Imperial bulkheads as he inspected the scene. Tumladen Station was honeycombed with this unfamiliar bone-like substance. It was as hard as steel and seemed to have streamed through and around the walls and corridors, melting out in some places and creating an unpalatable veneer in others. This particular formation had somehow eaten through the bulkhead and spilled out into the passageway. He scanned the vital sign readouts for his men projected onto his eye lenses. All 6 runes were green. They had split into 2 combat squads upon reaching the station, and the second squad was paralleling them 3 decks below. He was glad to have Squad Corgan here with him. They were 3 of the most experienced members of the company. Their powered fists and high-output bolters were well suited to the cramped halls of this unfortunate place. He motioned to them.
Forward, Sergeant. Clear the next intersection.
Ajantis, known by his title Spear of the Angel, and in charge of the shorter range and close combat elements of the 3rd Company, ducked into an empty storage room to let the hulking warriors in Gravis armor and one of his squad mates pass, leaving the 3rd as rear guard. The corridors were too narrow for the Marines to move around each other. It was a tactical problem, being unable to maneuver, but they trusted in their armor, and that if there was something to run into on this station, it would regret the encounter. He smiled as he keyed his vox to his counterpart, the Eye of the Angel.
Lieutenant Corin, how is First Class treating you?
His friend commanded the ranged support units that had saved Ajantis' skin on several occasions with his well-timed overwatch.
Drinks and meals served, but no guests,
came the reply. Ajantis could hear plasma coils on Corin's warriors' guns cycling in the background, along with the idling Thunderhawk engines. His helmet was off. All the Tears bore some resemblance to their angelic Primarch, but any such similarity for Corin had been erased years ago by a hail of Eldari shuriken rounds.
Cover your mug. The locals aren't used to that graffiti.
Corin cut the link without replying, and Ajantis kept his grin up. It seemed the Eye did not like being reminded of his injury or being left to babysit their exfil point. Ajantis slipped out of the storage locker and took his place in front of the rear guard. He padded down the corridor after Sergeant Corgan, continuing to pan his light and add it to the helmet lumens of his escort. The station was pitch black inside. Life support and gravity systems were operational, but there was little illumination. Their job was to penetrate the labs, while Squad Viking moved below them and reactivated some of the station's systems. If possible, he would enter the work areas alone. The Soul Warden had been adamant about secrecy.
Clear,
came the bass voice of Sergeant Corgan.
The lab should be just ahead.
Ajantis said,
Good. Open the door to the lab and secure the first room and this corridor.
Corgan hesitated, expecting more to the order.
Go,
said Ajantis. The sergeant approached the door, deactivating his fist and tapping the blank control panel. Nothing. Ajantis heard the buzz of energy as the fist powered back up. After 3 well-placed strikes, the door was open, and the Marines lumbered in to clear the room. The place was ransacked. Paper notes and data slates littered the deck, along with an assortment of arcane tech used in the researchers' experiments. Ajantis also noted several blood smears along the walls and floor. He followed the trails to the ceiling, noting that a mass of bone spewed out from the line where the floor and ceiling met, the gap creating a ledge leading back into the guts of the ship. The blood trail led right up to it.
All units, we may not be alone. Uploading footage.
As he said this, he transmitted a short clip of the bloodstains and the ominous opening in the bulkhead. He received vox clicks from his squad Vicon and Corin. Then a new voice entered his helm on a private frequency.
Proceed as planned, Lieutenant,
said Witness Annelman from the bridge of the Echo of Blood.
Find what we came for.
Ajantis acknowledged and opened a channel to Corin.
Stay alert, brother. We might not meet these enemies in the corridors.
Corin's voice came back steady.
It is you I am concerned about. Your men are exposed. Be quick about your work and we can destroy this place from the Echo.
There was no background noise this time. His helmet was on. Ajantis couldn't help it. He had to get in one last jibe.
I wish you hadn't taken my advice, brother.
Chapter 2. Witness Annelman and Soul Warden Tycentis stood on the bridge of the Echo of Blood, scanning the data screed from the assault and rearguard elements. I wonder if we sent enough, said the Soul Warden, keeping his voice near to subvocal levels so none of the mortal crew or the Tears standing guard could hear them.
You sound jumpy, Soul Warden. This is hardly our first mysterious trail of blood.
Tycentus did not smile and adjusted the output on the command console, widening the spectrum of frequencies being pulled by the sensor feeds. It is not the blood, Witness, but the reason we are here that troubles me. Nothing about this station or its work are truly known.
Do you think he was here?
The Soul Warden's frown deepened as he silently considered his response. Absolutely. The place is riddled with the unnatural, but what kind? We shall see. Aloud, he said, "The warp is never precise, Anoman. You know this." The Witness spoke as he absorbed a new wave of negative contact reports.
Saravok still haunts you, doesn't he?
This seemed to catch the Soul Warden off guard, his head swiveling to face the Witness. His eyes burned in a way Anoman had never seen before, and now it was he who took a step back. That business and this are not the same. Leave me to do my duty, and I will allow you to continue to do yours. The Witness bristled at the insult, baring his teeth and narrowing his eyes. Though the Soul Warden's position carried the highest honor in the company, and the chapter masters always came from their ranks, it was the Angel's Witness who captained the ship and took tactical command of engagements. He would be damned if anyone, even Tycentus, dared to even suggest usurping his authority, even though it was only recently bestowed. He was the first of the unnumbered sons to be given this high position in the Tears. He meant to give credit to himself and all his kind. Unintentionally, their dispute had risen in volume, drawing glances from the Astartes standing watch, but any further altercation was cut off by a Vox transmission from Squad Vicon. Both Anoman and Tycentus immediately attended to the video feed from the station, the Witness toggling the main viewer from Lieutenant Ajantis, who was pushing deeper into the labs, over to Sergeant Vicon in the Enginarium.
Power generators are down,
came the voice of the sergeant, ensuring his helm's picked recorder pointed to the areas of damage.
Estimated time to
He was cut off by a clanking scrabble, and everyone on the bridge paused to listen. This was not Anoman's first time controlling a ground engagement from the Echo, but he still disliked not knowing from what direction the sounds were coming. Like all of his kin, he was a natural warrior, and when he wasn't physically present on the battlefield, he felt handicapped and disconnected. So for now, he deferred to the warriors in the field and gave no orders. The Soul Warden and Witness's eyes followed the sergeant as he rotated, wrist-mounted bolters trained in front of him. A large, hulking shadow, all talons and angled plates, flitted across the video feed, and Vicon let loose with his bolters. The explosive rounds lit up the area and tracked the creature. Chunks of bulkhead spewed out as the bolts detonated near and around the shape, but none seemed to hit their mark. As the smoke cleared, the bridge crew heard the autoloaders cycling as the weapons prepped for another volley, but all was silent. The creature was gone. Chapter 3. Ajantis scrolled through the data files as quickly as the machine would allow, filing away in his mind Witness Anoman's fallback order to Vicon. Not alone indeed. If what they were searching for wasn't so vital, he would support simply blowing the station to bits without this incursion. Squad Corgan's vital signs showed green 3 rooms away, standing watch and reporting no movement or sound. He was becoming impatient. The data had to be here. It was unlikely Chirac could have come here and left no trail. If Ajantis had learned anything about the Imperium, he knew that everything was recorded and cataloged. The problem was finding what you wanted. Anything imaginable was available, but it was unfailingly buried in a mountain of ancillary information. An army of the Administratum's best scribes could spend centuries sifting through their archives and perhaps still come up empty-handed. Many of the station's automatic systems continued generating reports despite months of inactivity. It was these he was forced to filter through now.
We will find this criminal and take back what he stole,
he thought as he set his jaw and continued the search. Ajantis saw one of Squad Corgan's runes, Brother Hare, flash red a second before the bolter fire started. His masterwork sword was out before he finished spinning on his heel. He surged back towards the door, alerting the Echo to their plight with a specialized Vox ping. Brother Dallas was already down by the time he made it through to the second lab, tossing a large operating table out of his way as he barreled through the space. Corgan's own vitals still showed a solid green as the lieutenant shoulder barged the last door open. He crashed into the room, immediately finding himself sprawled on the floor, having tripped over Brother Hare's armless corpse. Recovering and sprinting forward, he saw the back of an enormous creature in bone-laced power armor. It deflected Corgan's fist with a taloned hand and forced the sergeant into a corner. Ajantis' sword split the armor and bit deep. He could feel the resistance ebb as the blade broke through the front of the ceramite chestplate. The alien scream that emerged from its throat caused his auditory filters to momentarily block out all sound, deafening him as if a tank's main gun were firing next to his head. The abomination spun and threw Ajantis off, not caring in the least for the blade in its torso. The spear of the angel flew 10 meters across the room and slammed into the bulkhead, creating a dent another meter deep in the steel. He wrenched himself up, glad that his sword remained in his hand, and got his first good look at the enemy. The creature was definitely once an Astartes, but now covered in the same bone-like substance permeating the station. Worse than that, a protrusion of the same material jutted out of its head like a spiked helmet plume, and its hands were replaced with oversized hooked talons. He had seen the results of those weapons with brothers Hare and Dallas. As the flames of a red thirst seeped into him, he watched in disbelief as their full fury came down on Sergeant Corgan and shredded him from hip to shoulder. He had only seen Eldar move with that kind of speed. Lieutenant Ajantis roared a wordless battle cry and renewed his assault. The monster whirled and avoided the lieutenant's two-handed chop, redirecting the sword with one of its talons and only taking a nick on its edge.
This is no mindless beast,
thought Ajantis. It seemed to know that a direct hit from the powered blade would shear right through its own weapons. As it dodged, Ajantis tried to find a chapter,
or legion,
he thought, insignia on its black armor. None were visible, but it could have been covered over by the bony plates. He didn't get long to ponder on this. It counterattacked with the same shocking speed that had laid Squad Corgan low, driving him back with powerful blows over Brother Hare's body and back deeper into the labs, all the while producing the hideous shriek from its black mouth. Ajantis took several glancing blows as he was able to cleave off chunks of bone and metal from the creature in return, but no wound seemed to slow it, not even the dire puncture from earlier. All the while, the red-edged talons began to get closer, and his parries came later and later.
What has Chirac done?
The Soul Warden had detected no chaos taint from the Echo, but this thing fought like a demon. None of the boarding parties had yet seen the inarticulate scrawls or the ravening of madmen that generally festoon the walls of fanes dedicated to the archenemy. No runes of dark power covered the floors. Then, as he countered a decapitating strike from the monster and punched back with his fist, he saw its eyes clearly for the first time. He saw the same red flames that danced in the eyes of his lost brothers. The flaw. So the worst is true. He felt his back against the pile of data slates and terminals he had recently been perusing. At last, a blow came he could not deflect, so instead he rolled. As the talon came down, sparks from the impact ignited an active fuel feed, perhaps still full or pooled there from when the station was operational. Whatever the case, Ajantis' roll turned into a skittering tumble as the explosion blew him sideways, careening off the deck and shattering ancient equipment. The beast fared little better, flying backwards and sporting motes of flame across its partially melted front. It started to rise as the secondary explosions began. Ajantis never saw what happened to the creature. The blast wave and then the flame engulfed him, collapsing the floor and ceiling and burying him under tons of twisted metal and machinery. Chapter 4. We just lost Ajantis. The whispered declaration by the naval rating was punctuated by Anoman's ceramite fist impacting on the command chair's console, smashing the fragile screens and crumpling the entire armrest. He shot a fiery look at the Soul Warden, certain the Psyker would not need to read his thoughts to know them perfectly.
Is this worth it?
He knew immediately that the answer was yes, regretting the reaction. The Soul Warden was as loyal and committed as he. For his part, Tycentus kept his face blank, allowing the young commander to make his own decision without interference. Anoman considered his options, his mind sprinting through the possible scenarios and arriving to a single conclusion.
Lieutenant Corrin, retrieve Squad Vicon and evacuate the station. Remain in the void until reinforcements arrive.
Switching channels, he said.
Cerned, Keldorn, prepare those who are dead and the veterans. We will cleanse this filth and retrieve the gene seed of the fallen. Meet me in the main embarkation deck in 5 minutes.
The witness was furious, not only for the loss of proven battle brothers, but a personal reason as well. He and Ajantis had fought together under the leadership of the Lord Commander before joining the Tears and starting anew. In fact, they had grown and hung in stasis pods next to each other, aboard the Tsar, Ksator, and the lieutenant was the first fellow Marine he had known. He would not allow this to stand. He would destroy the enemy in person, whatever it was. The decision made, Anomen stood and swept towards the bridge's exit, stopping in front of Tycentus. He did his best to temper his rage and save it for the true enemy.
Do you sense anything now, Soul Warden?
Tycentus looked back at him with the cold eyes of one who has seen Sanguinius's last moments and managed to stay sane, but there was no anger or resentment in his reply.
I sense nothing specific. Beyond that, you already know. But you have been wrong before,
Anomen thought as he looked the Soul Warden in the eye, the librarian's Terminator plate bringing him to an equal height with the witness's Gravis armor. He had no choice but to trust the venerable Psyker. He had led the company through much worse. Anomen turned, his cloak of office billowing about him, and nearly made it to the door. He spun back around as multiple alarm bells went off simultaneously and orders were shouted. The next moment birthed a new fact, one as unexpected as it was unwelcome, with casualties aboard the station and an unknown foe. Warp ripples closing quickly. The Soul Warden had sensed it first, instantly ordering the battle barge to full readiness, followed a split second later by an alarm triggered by the navigators.
How had they gotten so close?
Thought the witness. Any approaching ships should have been detected long ago. It didn't matter was Xenos or the archenemy. All Anomen knew was that the Echo was still warming its main batteries when a sleek, black warship dropped out of the Immaterium, ready for a fight. Chapter 5. Lieutenant Corrin took in the situation. Ajantis dead, pulling back to the void. Squad Viking was near the docking bay and may need support. He racked his custom bolt rifle and prepared to move out and collect them. He dared appropriate only 2 of the Marines in the plasma squad, leaving the balance to guard the Thunderhawks along with the 3 jump Marines with autocannons. The birds were hot and ready to fly at a moment's notice. The 3 Astartes moved through the docking bay and opened a hatch leading into the depths of the station. They patrolled across an access bridge, about 30 meters long and 5 wide, covered in the flowing bone that was the main feature of this forsaken place. Corrin glanced over the edge, making out drooping extrusions of bone reaching down towards the depths like so much dried wax. The area was pitch black, his grayscale night vision barely piercing to the walls and failing completely with regard to a ceiling or lower levels.
Lumens,
He whispered, and 2 glowing rays appeared alongside his own in the gloom. Specks of dust, disturbed by their passing, floated through the light beams and accentuated the air of intrusion. Eyes scanning everywhere at once, Corrin saw that the bone was not limited to the deck. With the light, he could now see the walls, and they too were covered in it, as if plasma had melted the side of a cliff. The Eye and his escort approached the hatchway at the end of the bridge. He leaned in and listened, hearing the heavy footfalls of his brothers approaching from the other side. As he voxed to warn them that he was opening the hatch, bolter fire rang out. He charged through onto another identical bridge and felt superheated plasma from his brothers fly past his head and into the fray. Squad Viking fought 2 of the monsters, matching the haphazard report from Ajantis, their shrieks filling the still air and mutations damning them in the eyes of the Emperor. They ignored the concentrated bolter fire from the squad and flashed forward, one of them impaling a Marine on its talon. The beast lifted him up and slammed him into Vicon himself, sending them both crashing through the flimsy railings and over the edge. Corrin moved forward, firing his rifle, picking out what appeared to be soft spots in the armor, to no avail. He marveled at their speed. No grace, like the aliens whose weapons marred his face, but deadly in their own right. Then he heard a crash behind him and shouts of warning. He whirled, bringing his bolter up to confront the new threat. Its back was to him. He knew the plasma rifles would not have completed their cooling cycle and could not fire yet. He heard the last remaining member of Squad Vicon calling for aid against the other 2 foes. They could not win this fight. He flicked his eyes and his Vox came up, ready to order the remainder of his team in the docking bay to prepare to disembark under fire as they retreated. But before he could speak, a soft orange rune flashed weakly on his HUD and then disappeared.
Ajantis. He was alive. And Vicon maybe too,
He thought. He turned back towards the lone Marine as the embattled warrior punched one of the creatures in the chest with its power fist, melting the armor and bucking its head back. Corrin didn't hesitate, pulling the trigger and blowing out its neck, effectively decapitating it. The shriek stopped as the monster stumbled back and toppled into the dark. So they weren't invincible. Corin watched in his helm as the runes of his escort disappeared, their combat blades faring poorly against these monsters. The last of Squad Vicon fell before his eyes, another casualty to the speed and ferocity of the enemy. Corin was hemmed in now, and his foes approached with all the grace of predators who know their prey is doomed. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. He fingered his bandolier of grenades and considered his chances of making it back to the Thunderhawks. He liked the odds. Cradling 2 of the explosives in his hand, he tossed them both towards the one stepping over Squad Vicon's corpses. The smoke and frag grenades detonated together, the shock wave from the frag pushing the smoke out and instantly obscuring all the combatants. Corin hoped the renewed screams from that direction meant it had slowed it down. He turned and ran towards the remaining monster, anticipating its blind strike and ducking into a low roll to pass under the blow. At the same time, he dropped his last smoke grenade to add to the confusion. He recovered from the roll and took 2 steps towards the exit and waiting Thunderhawks.
No,
He thought.
orders be damned.
He wasn't leaving Ajantis and Vicon behind. He instructed the Thunderhawks to depart over the Vox, and under the cover of the smoke and inhuman shrieking he leapt over the bridge railing, following his brother and the monster he had killed into the blackness.